All right, this is Roger Mark from Billings, Montana. This guy says it exactly. The Federal Reserve, quote unquote, is a worldwide banking cartel. Let me repeat that. The Federal Reserve is a worldwide banking cartel.
Recent history included. We can learn more about the future by studying the past than we can by studying the editorials or the political statements of politicians. So now we come back to your issue, which is this thing called the Federal Reserve. What is it? You called it the cabal. It certainly is a cabal. I wasn't sure years ago. What's the cabal? I've heard it used. I know it's not good. I had to look it up. And but anyway, it's. Let's be very precise about this. The Federal Reserve is a cartel. It's a cartel, no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. Happens to be a banking cartel. And this is very clear, and nobody in the banking industry really denies that because they can't. That's what it is. They just don't talk about it. It's not in the history books. And as you mentioned, they go to great extent to make it seem like it's a government agency. And if you understand the history of how this came about and you read the comments of these bankers themselves back in between 1910 and 1913 when they were assembling this and selling the public on it, it's very clear.
Between 1910 and 1913. I didn't know they were taking 3 years to sell the public on this. Remember, they were also getting the politicians in line to push this through illegally. Another way to win the war financially and to screw us over financially and to own this country financially. All together, same thing.
That they knew they were forming a cartel. They called it a union, an association, a grouping, a community. They called it all different things. I don't think I ever saw them use the word cartel, but that's what it was. So if you understand that the Federal Reserve is a cartel, which means it's an association, an organization of members in a particular industry, companies that have joined together to limit or reduce the areas of competition between them so that as an industry they move as though they were one company, even though they are divided up and they are on the surface at least competitors. They all got together at some point and they said, look, why are we competing with each other? Why do we cooperate with each other? Why do we have price wars, for example? Well, I'll tell you what, you can have North America, I get South America, I produce automobiles, you produce tractors, we share patents and resources, we buy into each other's companies, we hold stock, and so we're really operating as friends, not competitors. And so about the only level of competition is we'll have advertising campaigns. We may even criticize each other along the way to make it look like we're bigger and better than they and so forth. But when it comes down to really economic matters, there's no competition at all. And so that's a cartel, and they do that so that they don't have to reduce prices. They don't have to compete on services. In this case, the Federal Reserve, they created a regulatory agency, which is themselves, made it look like they were the government, and they regulate themselves in such a way that it's a cakewalk for them. And the public pays through the nose because there's no competition. Interest rates are all pretty much the same, within a half a point. They have some flexibility, but products and services are all limited. The point being that the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. That's as plain as that. And the reason it seems to be a government agency is because when they nailed their cartel agreement back in 1913, they finally got it all spiffed up and they got it passed through Congress. What they really did is they took this agreement that they created between themselves, and now you have to use your mind on this. And mentally, they erased the top of the paper that said Cartel Banking Agreement. They erased that, and they wrote down instead Federal Reserve Act. And with the magic of changing the heading, they turned a cartel agreement into a piece of legislation. The legislation then was presented.
Now listen to this. By changing that and putting a Federal Reserve Act from this cartel heading, they made it a piece of legislation. These guys were slick. Let me tell you, they're very slick.
To Congress. All the dummies in Congress raised their heads and said, that sounds like a good idea to me. And now the cartel agreement is law. So people wonder, well, if I could go to prison for violating the terms of a cartel, how can that be? It has to be government, right? Because only government can put you in prison. Well, you get half credit for that answer. That's true. But when the government and the cartel join forces and they become as one, a hybrid, and you get the government to enforce the cartel agreement, now you go to prison through the government, yes, but the government in this case is obeying the directives of the cartel.
Now you need to understand how treasonous this is. This is how they got rid of the Constitution. This is how they got rid of the law and order. This is how they got rid of and controlled the politicians. Because now the politicians are in the pockets of the cartel, and the nation is in the pockets of the cartel, and so are the corporations. And now this institution, this cartel, controls this nation, its corporations, all the money matters, and the politicians all in one sole swoop. That's as plain as you can be. Nothing more treasonous, nothing more deadly, and they did it without firing a shot.
So most people think that the government regulates the Federal Reserve. But in reality, it's the other way around. The Federal Reserve regulates the government. And once you understand this topsy-turvy arrangement that has evolved over 100 years, that all of the confusing factors in today's news begin to make sense. You know, they're always talking about, well, the banks are in trouble. The banks have to be bailed out. How come everybody's getting bailed out except me? You know, the big corporations are bailed out. Well, which big corporations are getting bailed out? Well, the ones that owe a lot of money to the Federal Reserve and to the banks. If the banks, if the corporations are struggling and they cannot pay the loans that they have to the banks, well, then this is serious for the banks.
So now you understand why this is so treasonous. Wrap your mind around what was just said. The cartel, Federal Reserve, owns the federal government, owns the corporations, owns the money, and owns this nation, owns the world. Every major nation in this world, over 140 of them, have national banks owned and controlled by the Federal Reserve or the Rothschilds. Doesn't matter what you call it. The Rothschilds own the money of this world. It's in the trillions. It's in the trillions. Now you understand why we lost sovereignty, we lost our nation, we lost our monetary system, we lost the Constitution, we lost our freedoms, and we're in financial bondage under this Federal Reserve cartel. Griffin says here, Edward Griffin says, and this man, he's totally right, says we need a revolution in money education. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Or have one in the first place, unless you have sound money. The two go together. So, what we need are people in office who are not of such a mindset. But until the American people, and I'm not talking about just the American people, this is a phenomenon around the world. Every political system, the educational level, the economic or monetary educational level of the people themselves is deliberately stunted by the system. The system does not want people like you and me and everybody else to understand money. They don't want us to understand what I just said a moment ago and what you're saying. Because as long as we're ignorant of that, we just go along and say, oh, yeah, well, how much money am I making? Oh, this is good. I got a pay raise. And you don't care how much they're spending in Congress. You don't care how the money comes into existence. As long as, I can afford a new car or a new couch or something. That's all they want you to focus on is how it helps you in the short term. You're not supposed to think about what it does to you and everybody else in the long term. So what we need, is a revolution in political and economic education, which is one.
A revolution in political and economic education. Absolutely. Absolutely. Never heard it said any better. He tells you where you can get more education on all this. realityzone.com.
Our commercial site, first of all, where we sell books and recordings with documentation and historical narratives for the important topics that we're discussing, and that's called Reality Zone. It's easy to remember, realityzone.com, and you'll find close to 100 books and recordings, video recordings, documentaries, seminars, lectures, the whole thing, everything at realityzone.com. Now, my real love is over on the other side, where we have nothing to sell but facts. And we're not even selling those, we're giving them away. We're saying, come on in, get some free facts and so forth. And that's our think tank operation, which is Freedom Force International. Now, if anybody is interested on the other side of these discussions, which means what are we going to do about it? You get the two sides. Most people are, oh, this is terrible. Oh, did you know this? Oh, wait till you hear this. You know, all the problems and it's enough to keep you going and it keeps you awake at night. But now if you get, all right, you get filled up with that and suddenly you get this idea, hey, this is serious stuff and it's affecting my life. It's going to affect my future and my kids and my grandkids and all my friends and my country and the world. What are we going to do about it? Is there a way to change it? Now you begin to look at the bigger picture. Now you want to know questions. You start asking questions. Why did this happen? What are the movements? What's the philosophy? What's the thinking process that makes this happen? And how can we affect a change in those things? And now we're talking about Freedom Force International. So that's our think tank, and we've built an organization which we're all dedicated. We've dedicated our lives, I mean, right next to our family and our country and our personal obligations. We've dedicated our lives to try and make a difference in the world and turn these trends around. It can be done. And it doesn't take a lot of people. People think, well, I got to have 51% of the voters. We'll never reach that. They're dummies out there. They don't care, you know. Well, maybe there are dummies out there. We've all been there. I've been a dummy most of my young life before I woke up to these things. So there's hope for even the dummies. And they do care if you can get through to them. But the point is, it's not necessary. Probably the number of people that determine the course of history has always been, I'm going to say, about 1% or less. It's an amazing thing. You take a look at just the American Revolution, for example. 3% or less of the population was even involved in the American Revolution. Between the men that grabbed their muskets and went into battle, the leaders, the people like James Madison and Jefferson and all the Washington. You add them all up. I mean, it was probably about 1% of the population, and another 2% fell in line because they had the strong leadership of these men, and the other 97% were like, gee, I wonder what's going to happen. And if the British had won the battles and crushed the revolution, I can assure you, the other 97% would have said, well, we've always been behind the crown all along. They were sort of waiting to see which side's going to win. That's the way it's always been in history, and it's certainly the way it is today. So once you understand that, it's both depressing and at the same time it's exhilarating, because it means that our mission really is much simpler than we thought. All we have to do is reach 3% of the bloody population, and this becomes a much more reasonable task. Well, of course, it's not just any 3%. We want the people who think, the people who care, people who have principles, people who have values, mostly people that read and just they want to know. And they have this feeling, this crusader instinct. I call it my crusader gene. Some people have it. It just sparks, and all of a sudden you say, I've got to do something about that. Those are the people we're trying to reach. So those are the people that will be attracted to Freedom Force International. So I'm speaking to your audience now, the 3% of you folks out there, or the 1% somewhere in there. If you feel like you want to do something about this, and you want to be a changer, and you feel this responsibility to your kids and your grandkids, then you better come on over and take a look at Freedom Force. You're going to find some interesting stuff there.
All right, that's the challenge for us to do. I'm going to look at this, see if there's any more on here, and we'll go from there. Now he has the most important closing statement here. Remember, the media is theater, and its emotional impact is trying to create an impression on your mind to control you, your thinking and your actions and your life.
So
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
wise words by G. Edward Griffin, author, activist, and really all around just really spectacular person with a great amount of knowledge about the Fed and many other things. And we're just so delighted, Ed, that you were able to come here with us today on Northwest Liberty News. Is there anything that you wanted to say in closing that I didn't get a chance to perhaps ask you, or anything you wanted to leave the folks with before we let you go?
Well, I think I pretty well talked it through. I'll just say in closing that don't be discouraged. We're not alone, even though it seems that way. I'm going to say that much of what you see on television is theater. It looks like the world is really, it looks like America is falling apart, and there are pieces of it that are. But remember, what you see on your television set has been put there to create an impact on your thinking. 99% of the American people are solid. They have good values. And even though we're losing, every year we lose a lot of young people that we think we're doing them a favor by sending them to college. We save our money and we're going to get our children to college, and we send them to college and they get indoctrinated and we lose the kids. Even though that process is very...
Anyhow, remember that this media is a sham. You know it's fake, you know it's drama, and you know it's not the truth. We are not alone, and we will be victorious. It only takes 1% to 3% to change the world history. Think about that. That's the best news I've ever heard for the day. Again, this is Roger Martin from Billings, Montana. Good day.